Welcome to Dropping In, Legends in Risk Management, the YouTube channel where we invite people of great achievement in the field of risk management and have conversations with them about what they have learned over the course of their careers about how to be successful in risk management. Today, we welcome none other than John Fraser, the man behind the ERM implementation at Hydro One and the author of some of the best-selling books on ERM ever. He is also one of the true pioneers of the field and wrote an article in the Journal of Applied Corporate Finance that made ERM reach through to a much wider audience by giving people a sense of what ERM could do at its best. John, a case can be made that you have turned more people on to ERM than Madonna has to sex.
Thank you. I don't think so. I think she has the record, but I tried.
Right. John, can you give us some background on your career and your experience with enterprise risk management?
Sure. Just to give a little background, I'm an accountant by training, and I spent many years at Coopers and Lybrand, auditing large financial institutions. And I then moved into an internal auditing role. I preferred process than I did just doing financial statements. And by age 40, I was on the board of directors of one of the second largest investment dealer in Canada, which is, something that heads of internal audit don't usually get to do. I spent the last 15 years of my career as a chief risk officer at a major electricity company. And I have done a lot of research and writing on enterprise risk management. As you mentioned, some textbooks. I've written many academic articles. I have taught a master's degree course at York University as an adjunct professor on enterprise risk management. I've taught our directors college, which is where board directors go to get their training. I've taught at Schulich School. So I've done lots of training and a lot of research, and it has been a passion for my life. And I've got lots of awards. I've got a fellowship award from the Institute of Chartered Accountants in Canada, which is only given to about less than 3% of their members. I've got a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Institute of Internal Auditors. A couple of the biggest good things that have happened from enterprise risk management, I think, was I was twice invited to go and teach to the management team at United Nations in New York. They've got a very lean and mean enterprise risk management group, and they're doing a good job, or certainly up to the time I was there. So that was a highlight, as well as running risk workshops for our board of directors. For 3 years, I was running risk workshops with the full board of directors to get them involved in how we did things and to get their views, etc. So they're sort of two of the highlights of my career.
Wow, the UN, well, that's exciting. What was it like? What kind of questions did you get from that team?
Well, they are probably the largest, most complex, and most incredible organization. As you know, there's a lot of politics involved, but they're dealing with famine, they're dealing with wars, and they've got these tremendous risks, and they've got people all over the world. So, for example, they have champions in the various departments and all over the world, and then they have a coordination function that tries to pull them all together to do risk profiles and to have conversations around risk. So it was very interesting to see the progress they're made without a lot of costs and overhead. So they're doing a good job.
Interesting. But John, looking back, what about ERM caught your attention, and what made you think that it had some potential? Was there like a moment where you went, hey, this is...
Yeah, well, I had been hired as the head of internal audit at Hydro One, the electricity company, and they had had in 4 different sets of consultants to try and implement enterprise risk management, and nothing had really taken hold. Management felt that it was the best practice and they wanted to have it, but it just wasn't working. And so finally, the chief risk officer came to me and asked me if I would take it on and take on the role of chief risk officer. And I said, okay, give me 6 months. If I can't prove its value, we're going to shut it down. I'm not going to keep it going. And within 6 months, we had done, it had taken hold. It was like a bushfire in Australia, where it just had become a very, very popular way of making decisions, getting people involved. We solved a lot of management's decision-making problems with it, and everybody felt it was really going to be a good thing. We had initially thought it might be a flavor of the month, one of these things that comes and goes. But 20 years later, it's still going strong at that company. It's gone through 5 or 6 boards of directors, management teams. And if the Harvard University came and did a video, which is still available from them, on our risk management process, and they interviewed the CFO and the CEO and the various executives, and they said we couldn't run the business without it. It helps us make decisions, it helps us prioritize, and it's just a good way of doing business.
So I guess after those 6 months, there was no question that we want this.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I'll give you a quick little story. The company was planning to go public, and they wanted to reduce their expenses to make the ratios look better. And what they did was they made a package offer to employees that if they took an early retirement package, they would get a good deal. And it ended up with 20% of the most experienced employees retiring on the same day. So if you can imagine the change in the risk profile of any organization, 20% of the most senior people leave, you've got a big, big risk to deal with. And they got us involved in doing an analysis and workshops, etc. Where are the risks from these people leaving? How are we going to mitigate it, etc. And this proved the value of enterprise risk management. So when we had finished with the management team, everyone walked out. They understood where the risks are. They understood what we were going to do to fix it. And there was just a common agreement. And so it was an example of how it can work in practice and help us get that buy-in from management.
That's good. We need positive stories about risk management as well, not just the disasters. All right, John, what is the purpose, would you say, of having an ERM process? What is it supposed to do?
Well, if you compare a company with it to a company without it. So a company that doesn't have enterprise risk management, which is most companies, they may or may not have clearly articulated objectives. So for example, when we started, there weren't clear objectives of what we were trying to achieve as a company. So I had to go into the president's speeches, into the annual report. I had to look through the general ledger where we were spending money, because I figured if we're spending money, there must be risks there and things we're trying to achieve. And I actually then had to make up a level. Here are the 8 objectives, and then shop them with the management team. Is this what we're trying to do? So a lot of companies, they don't have clearly articulated objectives. Secondly, they don't have conversations around or identifying what are the risks, what is going to stop us achieving our objectives. And they definitely, in most cases, don't have a methodology using risk criteria in order to allocate the resources. What happens is the vice president, with the most persuasive demeanor and nice talk, gets the money, and a bigger risk might be in another department that can't make a case. So you don't necessarily have a good allocation of resources to where they're most needed. And finally, in many of these companies, capital requests go to the board. We want to spend X million of dollars, and here's a discounted cash flow showing we'll make 20% over 25 years, and there's no risk assessment. And the board doesn't say, okay, you're going to put in this new computer system. What are the risks? What are the risks to achieving it? And what are the collateral risks that can come? Because often you do a project and it creates other risks. But the point is, these things are going to the boards and being approved, and there's no risk assessment. So enterprise risk management deals with all of these things, with the objective being to help management make better decisions.
I agree to that, John. We have to be better at making risk visible in these project evaluations and such. But why doesn't risk management happen spontaneously in organizations then? What is wrong with us, so to speak, since we need something like...
Well, I would say it's because a lot of people don't know what it's capable of. In this famous book by my friend Håkan, in his concluding remarks chapter, which is probably one of the best chapters I've read on risk management theory, he makes the point that there are 2 ways you can approach enterprise risk management. One is, and this is what most companies, including financial institutions, do, you can have it as a compliance function. You go around, you do a couple of surveys, you produce a risk profile, the board supposedly looks at it, but it doesn't change anything. Or you can integrate it into management, into decision making, into how you run the business. And so that's a choice management has. Now, a lot of companies, and what I tell people is that enterprise risk management will not work necessarily in every company. The chances of it succeeding depend on a number of things, one of which is whether the management team wish to have it. And there are a lot of companies where the CEO is scared of it because suddenly it may take away some of that person's power, because knowledge will now become more shared and they will no longer have a dictatorship type of management style. So there are a lot of CEOs that don't necessarily want to be a team player or share or have that kind of approach. So there are a lot of reasons why it fails, apart from the fact that people don't necessarily understand it or use the right techniques. But in a lot of cases, management just doesn't want it. They want to do things the way they have always done them. So my dream is that enterprise risk management will eventually become taught in every Bachelor of Commerce program, every MBA program. So people coming into business from universities will know its capabilities, how to do it, and it will become an expectation of good management.
Well, cheers to that, John, and thank you for the generous mention of my book. But then there are the silos, so-called, John. And one idea that has fascinated me increasingly is that ERM, by consciously now trying to break down the silo effects in risk management, creates benefits for the business more broadly as well, because you get people together, you look at the business in a different and more holistic way. So you can potentially remove silo effects in a lot of other ways too in the business. Like ERM is the vanguard in the battle against the silos, or something along those lines. Am I onto something here?
You're absolutely right. I mean, most companies, historically, the way they have been run is that they are in silos. So sales and marketing are one division, production is another, accounting is another, and they really don't have a mechanism to share or to understand what happens. Now, with enterprise risk management, and one of the keys, I should back off and say that the key to enterprise risk management consists of two things. But if you're doing my master's degree course in enterprise risk management, in order to pass, you have to be able to remember two words. One is conversations, and the other is prioritization. And one of the keys to enterprise risk management is having conversations, structured conversations about risk. And this happens through risk workshops at the board level, ideally, at the management team level, at the departmental level, on projects, etc. And this is where people get into a room with a good facilitator to discuss the risk and what they're trying to achieve. And it's almost magical. People come out of these workshops and tell me, this is the greatest thing I've been in. I now understand why Joe needs the money in his department. I didn't realize he had all of those risks. And I love the opportunity that now I can share my challenges, and other people are now being supportive of me. So it's very much a team approach. If you are a sports person, a soccer or any other sport, you don't go into that game without having discussed what you're trying to achieve, how you're going to do it, what the risks are, who is the opponent's best player, who's going to mitigate that risk by taking them out. So it's very much a team approach. Now, if management does not want a team approach, it isn't going to work. So it is really a culture change. My staff won the President's Award for Culture Change back in 2002 because we had changed the culture. People now were sharing, there was a team approach, and there was this general feeling that the culture was being changed. And we can talk about that later as to how we did that.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, John, that the ERM is a culture project as well, which we'll get back to. But John, getting people together and having good and candid conversations about risk sounds like the way to go. But who should be in these conversations, you think? What is the ideal mix of professionals?
Well, in a variety of ways. So for example, after we did our first risk profile, which we had done by interviewing executives and risk experts, and came up with, so here's the top 10 risks in the company, the CEO then said, we need to engage the management team in this. How are we going to do that? And I said, well, allow me 40 minutes on every monthly management meeting, and we will have a workshop on a single risk. So for example, on the very first risk, we decided to do environmental, and we ran a risk workshop. We had our environmental expert in the back of the room to answer any technical questions. And we ran this risk. We use anonymous voting technology, so people can vote. It was funny because the first workshop we ran, we explained what we were going to do, and then we asked the management team, using their little keypads, to vote on a scale of 1 to 5 on how big this risk could be. And it was like at a tennis match, because when we said that, all the heads turned to watch the CEO, because that is how decisions were made previously. What does the CEO think? And so we can agree with her. But now suddenly the management team realized with this anonymous voting technology, they could make up their own mind and vote differently. And so suddenly this brought out all sorts of great discussions, because if you ask people to vote on something on a scale of 1 to 5, and everybody comes up with a vote, let's say most are 3 or 4, you can say, okay, there's a general agreement there. But if you ask them to vote and the vote comes up something like this, where there are a whole bunch of diverse views, you know you have something that is worth discussing. Why is it different? Why did you vote high? Why did you vote low? And you get this very rich discussion, which would not otherwise have happened.
Very interesting point, and that the fear factor can be influencing these conversations, that we are eager to please the CEO. That can be a problem, I guess, for
in most companies.
Most companies, and yeah. But then that's a good suggestion for how to get around that. But John, you mentioned earlier change and the change management process. Could you please elaborate a little bit on that?
Sure. I'll just give it. In addition to getting everybody involved in a sort of a team approach and understanding risk and et cetera, and have this all more transparent. A classical example was when in addition to running risk workshops, one of the things that I did was I went around and interviewed the top 40 people in the company every 6 months. And this was executives as well as risk experts, people who looked after environmental or insurance or safety, etc. And when I would go to department managers and I'd say, well, can we chat about what risks you have? They would say, oh, I don't have any risks. Everything's fine. I'm doing fine. No risk. And I realized that this wasn't working, because the only reason anyone in a company, any department has resources, money or people, is to mitigate risk. If you don't have risk, you don't need resources. So what I did was, as I went around, and if they told me I don't have risk, I said, well, that's great, because there are a lot of other people in the company that have risk. So if you don't have risk, you obviously don't need all these resources. So we're going to have to take some of your resources and give them to people who have risk. And suddenly people realized that the only way they could justify getting resources was if they could declare what risks they had to meeting objectives, etc. So when people went to the CFO and said, I need a bigger budget. Okay, what are your risks? What objectives are threatened or affected? How are we going to discuss it? So that really changed the entire way budgeting was done, resourcing was done, etc. And people, I'll give an example. We looked at the business plans. These are the written words around the numbers for the year before I started. And I told my staff, go and do a search for the word risk. I want to see how often risk is mentioned in the business planning. So they did a word search, and do you know how many words, the times risk was used? Oh. 0. It was a bad word. Nobody wanted to talk about it. After we started and we changed the culture, business plans were riddled with risk. In other words, I need the following resources because I've got the following risk to meet the following objectives. So it all tied together, because without that, they weren't getting any resources. So that was just a major way that culture was changed.
Yeah, that is a remarkable story. And what's also remarkable in that is that you struggled even to talk to managers about risk because they did not even want to admit they had any. Yeah. apart from your new approach there, or what you implemented, has the general willingness to talk about risk changed in the corporate sector if you compare now and then?
It's there, but and there are a lot of companies who in their annual reports have pages, particularly the big banks, pages and pages talking about risk, but they're not having the conversations among management. They're not actually doing enterprise risk management. I know a major company where they send out a survey to management asking them about their risks, and then these surveys are compiled and it goes to the board, but they have no conversations, and a department manager could say anything, and there's no validation if that is in fact correct. It's just a compliance function. It's not really changing how they absorb information and make better decisions. So there's a lot more talk than, it's an interesting question, because when we started back in 2000, we thought that within 5 years, this thing was so simple and so obvious that within 5 years, everybody would be doing it. And, if you read, there's an annual survey by the North Carolina State University. They have something called the ERM initiative, and they do an annual survey on ERM. And there's still only about 20% of companies in the US who claim to be doing ERM. Now, you can even say that maybe they're not, maybe they're optimists and they're not really doing it. That's only 20% after like 20 years. So there is still a major vacuum out there. And the vacuum comes because the boards don't know what to do. Well, that's half of it. So board directors should be turned into management saying, what are your risks? How do they affect your objectives? What is the probability of your meeting objectives? But they just don't know, because they haven't come through this. They weren't taught it at school. They didn't use it in their successful careers as CEOs, often become the board director. So they don't know what they're looking for. So later we'll maybe talk about my book, but one of the chapters in there is what the board should be doing in order to oversee risk management. And you can't oversee something unless you understand it. So there's a real education issue there, that board members currently don't really understand enterprise risk management and what their role should be. So,
yeah, the board is of some interest here, and we'll come back to that topic, John. But you're right, talk is cheap. The Finnair annual report of 2018, just before the pandemic, had actually 408 mentions of the word risk, but not a single one of the pandemic. So it's very much a boilerplate, kind of template thing, and but hopefully, we'll see more change. We're
making progress, but it's very slow, and there's been a lot of confusion. I guess they tried their best, but COSO, for example, caused major confusion. It was a good thing, bad thing. They helped promote the topic of enterprise risk management, but they made so many mistakes in theory in their 2004 that it just confused people and sent people down the wrong path in many cases. Now, their latest edition has got a lot better, but it still has a lot of mistakes. I don't want to beat up on them, because I think they're trying their best, but I'll just give two examples. First of all, in 2004, they ignored ISO 31000, which had been based on the Australian standard from 95 and 99, and figured they'd do their own thing. And so they missed a lot of good things that could have been done. The second thing is, even with the most recent edition, they define risk as to do with events, an event happening. Well, risk is not just an event. Risk is caused by uncertainty, by all things that happen, don't happen, might happen. It's all the uncertainty. Can you achieve this objective? Do you have enough resources? It's not just events, but they still have that wrong definition, So they're getting better, but I'm very glad that we started when we did. Things were simpler. Nowadays, anyone starting ERM, particularly if they're trying to use COSO, will be so confused they're going to have a hard time. Anyway, that's enough on that.
Yeah, risk is an elusive concept, and sometimes you're just not helping, even though you're trying hard. But anyway, John, let's come back to these forums that you created for conversations about risk, and people are able to talk openly and honestly about this, and that is a catalyst for change. Like there was a pent-up demand for that kind of conversation.
Yeah.
How can you keep this momentum up? Because after a while, I guess the risks will start to become known and look rather similar to last time round. And how can you keep it?
Yeah, well, you're right. And I think it depends on the organization. So for example, I used to audit, I was the insurance specialist auditing large insurance companies in Canada. And they were very, very stable, routine, very little change. You could almost predict their annual profits a year in advance because nothing much changed. Whereas the company I was with, Hydro One, was dramatic change. All sorts of things happened. CEOs got fired, boards got changed, projects went off the rails, all sorts of things happened. So the need for ERM, I would say, is entirely dependent on how much change is going on in the organization. So we had so much change, there was never any repeating of stuff. It was always things facing you that you had to deal with. So in terms of how we did it, so yes, I got the management team to have at least twice a year a risk workshop, and that was the management team. On every major project, we did risk workshops. So major computer installations, major construction projects, these all had risk workshops as part of the project plan. In addition, when you, as a department head, were doing a business plan and a budget, there was nothing better for a department head than to have a risk workshop with their direct reports and say, here are our objectives. Now let's discuss what's going to stop us meeting them, right? And so that when you walk out of that room, all of those department managers know what the objectives are, they know what the challenges are and the uncertainties, they know who's going to look after what and what's going to be done about it. You've got a team approach to tackle it. That was not something that's done historically in most companies, right? So that's one of the techniques that enterprise risk management encourages, so that everyone will function as a team, knowing what the challenges are, etc., and address them.
It's very interesting that the higher the rate of change, the more you need something like enterprise risk management.
Absolutely.
Change of topic, John. What skill sets are needed, would you say, for the Chief Risk Officer ERM role?
Well, I'll broaden that to the risk management function to include the Chief Risk Officer. So this is how I define it. For the Chief Risk Officer, you need someone who makes things happen. That was my role. I had to break down doors. I had to convince people. I had to make things happen, right? You know, when I stand up in front of a board of directors to run a risk workshop, I'm putting my career on the line, okay? You know, it's not something you want to undertake lightly, but that's my role as a Chief Risk Officer. The second most important thing is to have someone who I would define as a charismatic facilitator. This is a person who is going to run risk workshops. This is a person that people will feel comfortable talking about the risk and what needs to be done, etc. Now, I was very fortunate to have two such people in as my second in command. The most recent one, who has written is a co-editor of my new book. He's a singer in nightclubs, so he loves being on stage. When I run a risk workshop, I'm exhausted at the end of it. When he runs a risk workshop, he gets energy from the crowd. So he was the ideal person and brilliant in running risk workshops. He's got a chapter in our book on that. So that's two skill sets, and they're different. And the third skill set then is what I would call a data analyst. You need someone who can manage all of this data, because you're collecting data from workshops, from interviews, from KRIs, key risk indicators all over the company. You need someone to manage a lot of data. And those three skill sets don't often happen in the same person, right? Because they're different skills and techniques. There's a fourth skill set that you also need in a large company, and that is what I would call a champion. So like United Nations, they've got champions who have a dotted line to the risk function, but they're obviously reporting to local management. So they need a skill set where they can be convincing local management that they're on their side and helping them, and yet providing accurate information into the head office. And so that is obviously a very diplomatic skill to be able to do. So there are the four skill sets that I would define.
Interesting that you need both the people skills and the data skills
Absolutely.
as well. So keeps it interesting, I guess. But you mentioned the champions. Aren't good champions hard to come by? Are they made or found, you think?
Well, we didn't have them because we were very centralized. So we didn't have champions in our company. So I've not had personal experience with it. But for what I can see, obviously you've got to identify someone who is willing to take on the role and has the trust and confidence of the local management that they can do that role. So I'm not an expert in that area. That's usually done only in very large, multinational organizations who are geographically dispersed all over the country or the world that would need that.
Yeah, I agree. But it seems to me that the impact that risk management has is still sometimes depending on a certain individual, to the extent that that person is forceful and can create some kind of a vision that excites people, and they can shape their own role to a fairly large extent.
Yeah, you would need somebody who has that capability. I mean, you couldn't have a shrinking violet. You need someone who has a strong enough personality to make things happen. You're absolutely right. But but in most companies, it'll be a part-time job, right? I mean, it wouldn't necessarily be a full-time job. If you're in Hong Kong or Australia or Colombia, and you're just coordinating, keeping head office informed of what's happening locally. So it's usually, I think, a part-time job, but I'm not the expert in that area.
All right, so moving on to the next question here. John, what is the best way to introduce ERM into an organization?
I would say slowly. There are a couple of ways. I mean, first of all, I think you need to have some agreement at the top level. And what we did was we crafted a 2-page policy and got the audit committee to endorse that. So we now had, say, okay, at the highest levels, the board level, we now have approval to do enterprise risk management. So that was sort of a starting point. The next thing we did was to run pilots. And we ran a risk workshop. It was very successful. And that gave me the empowerment or the credibility to then start doing more things. I would not recommend any company deciding to do what I would call a big bang rollout. Issue your policy and then tell everybody suddenly you're going to have to do risk profiles and do this and do that and change your business planning methodology. That I think would cause a lot of challenges because people wouldn't be educated, wouldn't know what to do. So my suggestion is start with pilots and build on it. In any organization, you're always going to have the people who embrace change and you can leverage and they will be helpful. And then the middle group will follow along if they see this thing has value. But in any organization, there will always be what I call pockets of resistance. If you have 10 executives, 2 or 3 will prefer to shoot themselves rather than come on board and cooperate. We had them that didn't last long in the company because they weren't team players, and they made it quite clear that they were not going to be team players, so they didn't last. But so that's how I would recommend it.
All right, so shock and awe is not the way to go here. Rather go easy on people and roll it out through these pilots.
Oh, yeah. I've seen a lot of mistakes made. People decide to have it and they go and staff up. Suddenly they've got 10 staff, 20 staff, and they haven't got a clue what to do with them. And then suddenly people realize this is a big expense and it's not providing value and they close it down. So that's not a good way to go.
No, it makes sense to get some of the basics right first, and then scale up
Yeah.
from there. But John, you mentioned building the trust of executives through these pilots. What is the value they see in ERM at this point? I mean, how do the pilots change the cost-benefit calculus, you think, in the eyes of executives?
Well, what happens is you start to run your first workshop, either with the management team or with a department or at project level. And so what happens is you go in there and you've got your anonymous voting, and you're starting to ask people for their opinion as to how credible, how big a risk could be, how probable it is, and how good the controls are. And what happens with anonymous voting is suddenly, as I mentioned, you see this kind of result. You see a whole bunch of highs and a whole bunch of lows. And what happens is people look around the room and say, what's wrong with these people? This is a low risk. Why are they voting high? And other people look around and say, this is obviously a high risk. Why are they voting low? And what happens is you have these conversations and you clarify why they're doing or voting. You revote. That's called the Delphi method, where you vote and discuss and revote until you get some sort of not necessarily a total consensus, but everybody understands where they're coming from. But all of a sudden now you have people who understand better what they're trying to achieve, what the challenges are, what they're going to do about it, which they didn't have when they walked in the room. And as I say, some people have described it as magical, but it just makes a lot of sense. Because without that, everybody's in their little silos doing their own thing, and they don't know really what's going on. They don't have a confidence in the rest of the firm. So that's how it kind of, same with the project. You know, suddenly you realize that something's off the rails in a project. Let's put some resources there because we all are going to suffer if this project doesn't succeed. So it really is a team building exercise. So
yeah, it speaks to the value of getting people together and talking and sharing or trying to see the other's point of view. You know, so there's.
But it has to be a good facilitator. I strongly recommend using voting technology, because if you just have people in a room chatting, you get a dysfunctionality. You get the compulsive talkers, the boss who won't shut up. I mean, we ran our first risk workshop with a new CEO. We did our first vote. It showed the results, and he then talked for half an hour. He wouldn't shut up. He just kept giving his views. We never ran another workshop with him. We ran workshops with other members of the management team, but never with him, because he just would not allow us to facilitate a meaningful workshop. So as I say, it won't work in every case. It really depends on the quality of the management.
Right. Yeah, that's an interesting story again, John. Moving on to another topic is, we have the next question for you, which is how does ERM relate to the setting of business objectives? Because business objectives seem to have a central role in the ERM framework. So what's your take on that?
Absolutely. As I mentioned earlier, when I started ERM back in 2000, the company did not have clearly articulated objectives. They were implied. They were in president's speeches. They were in annual reports, referred to, but not here is a list of our objectives. So I actually had to compile them and then shop them around with the CEO and CFO and say, are these our objectives? Is this what we're, because without having clear objectives, you can't assess risk. We actually had a funny story where one of the executives asked to borrow our voting equipment to run his own risk workshop. So he gets in this room with his staff and he asks them to vote. And one of the staff who had been at our workshops and know how it should be said, well, excuse me, what are our objectives? Without knowing our objectives, we can't assess risk. And so that was the end of the workshop, because he hadn't gone to the trouble of defining his objectives. Right. So now ISO 31000 defines risk as the uncertainty around objectives. So objectives are the starting point. They're absolutely key. As you change your objectives, your risk changes. So when you're doing strategic planning, it's almost a synchronized role. You change objectives, your risk profile changes, right? And the two have to go arm in arm. So it's the starting point for every risk assessment. The other key thing on a risk assessment that people don't always realize is you have to define your time frame. I see people trying to run risk assessments or workshops saying, what is the risk? And they haven't defined a time frame, because the risk of something happening varies between, if so you're talking about 1 year, 5 years, or 50 years. So in my classes, I will turn to the staff, my students, and I say, what is the risk percentage of you dying? And they kind of hem and haw, and finally some puts up her hand and says 100%. And I said, absolutely. Okay, now what is the percentage probability of your dying within the next 2 years? Obviously, it's a very different number. So to do a risk assessment, you have to define your time frame, and a lot of people miss that.
Yeah, even a black swan, which is in some sense has a probability of 0 in the longer term, you know,
well, 1%
they too have 100% probability, right? So, but anyway, these objectives, John, what's there to say that the business objective is really worth protecting? I mean, clarifying them is makes a ton of sense. I agree, but aren't many objectives just aspirational and meant to motivate? And
well, you're absolutely right, and that's why the board of directors and the management team get the big bucks, because it is their job to decide if they are in fact the right objectives. Now, you're right in the sense that there are some management teams who will only set objectives for things that they are sure they can achieve and get their bonuses, right? That's something that the board has to control. We have a very, very good chapter in our new book on this topic, because what my 2IC, Rob Quayle, came up with, which was quite brilliant in my mind, is he's come up with a methodology and criteria so that the board and management team can discuss objectives in terms of relative importance. So these then have to be risk ranked or prioritized, if you will, because all objectives are not necessarily of the same importance. So now there's a methodology for the board and management team to rank or decide which objectives are most important and least important. Which of 2 objectives will you sacrifice in order to meet the other one? And then there's another chapter which another author, Mohammed Ismail, has written, which then takes that and builds on it and takes those ranking objectives into how to allocate resources, all numerical, all based on criteria and a prioritization process. So resources then get allocated to the most important objectives, etc. So there's a whole methodology around that. But without a stated objectives, you really can't proceed, because, you know, if I say, what are the risks to you of skydiving off of a bridge in New Zealand? What is the risk of you dying from that? Question. Probably, well, do you have an objective of going to New Zealand? Do you have an objective of jumping off a bridge? If you don't, then the risk is 0. If you do, it has a different answer. So everything has to be framed in terms of what are your objectives.
Yes, and that's an excellent clarification, John, and it's indeed essential to get the objectives right here as part of a risk analysis. But again, I want to come back to, if you want to play the devil's advocate here, and couldn't KPIs, let's say, you know, these key performance indicators and other objectives, aren't they sometimes not just, or aren't they sometimes outright stupid? Because I've seen that's a whole niche on the internet, for example, and I've heard of, for example, executives who've set up growth targets that are very aggressive, and as they go about that, they have to act in a fairly reckless way. They have to gamble the company in ways that are not optimal. How do you feel about
you're
that?
absolutely right. I was on the executive team for the last 10 years at my company. And I've been in all of these sessions where we were discussing KPIs, etc. And I can guarantee you that the instructions from the CEO to the management team is, do not set a KPI that I cannot achieve. Okay. I term KPIs as a way of ensuring that management gets their bonuses. Now, it's up for the board to try and make sure they're having a stretch target, etc. And they may set a stretch target, to your point, that is beyond capability, and then that may force management to do bad things in order to meet that. And the trouble is, a lot of KPIs may be only 8 or 10 or a number like that in a company, but there are so many things going on in a company, and if the whole focus becomes focusing on a KPI, things may get missed or neglected. And so a lot of this depends on the board's understanding and ability to assess management and their bonuses, not only in light of the strict KPIs, but also all the other considerations that happen during the year. If management achieves the KPIs but lets things fall by the wayside that we're not on the KPI, that's bad, right? Or if they step up and fix something that wasn't on a KPI but needed fixing, then they should be rewarded. But that requires a very mature board of directors, which may or may not be in place.
Well, that brings us to the very important topic of the role of a board of directors in an ERM process. I mean, if you look at the COSO frameworks and other frameworks before that in ERM, that's a novelty, right? That they assign this central role to the board of directors, and they are supposed to lead the way somehow, and they have this responsibility in terms of setting objectives, etc. According to you, John, what are the key steps that a board of directors needs to do regarding?
Yeah, okay. You're absolutely right. And a few years ago, for example, in 2000, when I took the risk policy to the audit committee, the chair of the audit committee said, "Why are you bringing this to a board committee? Risk is management accountability. It's nothing to do with the board." That's an exact quote, right? They did not feel, they thought management should look after risk and it wasn't anything to do with the board. So, but I think everybody's agreed now that the board has to oversee it. As I said earlier, the challenge is that boards don't know. You can't oversee something you don't understand. You can't look at your kids' homework and assess whether they've done a good job on math if you don't understand how they do math nowadays. So the first thing is there's a lack of education by board members on how to oversee risk management. So that's the key omission. The second thing is the boards are not having meaningful discussions around risk. It's often reactive. It's something crops up and they may chat about it, but they don't have structured, continuous, scheduled discussions around risk. A risk profile comes to them and they rubber stamp it. Mm-hmm. I had a funny situation where a board member, pretending that he was, doing good stuff. He was the CEO of another company, and let's assume his name was Peter. Said, "Okay, John, I think you should go over to my company and see how we're doing risk assessments, right? And maybe you'll learn something from it." So I go over to his company. I meet with his chief risk officer, who is a young person, just qualified. Says she doesn't know what she's to do, but because she's been given this job, she's going to do her best. So she shows me what she's doing, and she has a nice chart with the departments and the types of risk, and it's full of green and yellow boxes. And I said, "Well, that's very interesting, but how come you don't have any red? Don't you have any higher?" Says, "Peter doesn't like red." So you have clearly a board who is getting a risk report that doesn't show any high risk because the CEO doesn't want to show any high risk. Now, where was the board in that? How come they're not asking the right questions? So this is an example. I mean, the board has to probe. How was this risk profile prepared? How deep in the organization did you go? How about this? Because the board only has two jobs to do, or two things that they're paid to do. One is to hire and manage the CEO, and the second is to ask questions. Mm-hmm. But they're just not asking the questions. So they've got to be able to oversee it. Now, there are two other things that are missing. One is they should then be asking for the risk management process to be audited periodically, at least every 5 years, maybe every 3. Bring in external consultants, audit the risk management process, and what should we do? Our board asked for an audit. We were audited by one of the big accounting firms, risk management group. They gave us a gold star, which is, in their view, was excellent. And all of the recommendations were around the things that the board wasn't doing and should be doing. Once that report was issued, the board no longer had any interest in it. They never ever took any interest in doing the things that they were told they weren't doing and should do. So that was kind of a fun thing. There's another issue that I also would raise, that if boards and audit committees knew what they were doing, would have helped this whole thing along. And that is the 1992 COSO Internal Control Framework. Was a brilliant document, and it came up with 5 criteria or main themes around what constituted good internal control. And one of those things was risk assessments. So they said that for every process, for every department, etc., that you are looking at, one of the things that would constitute good internal control was a risk assessment plan. As a result, since 1992, internal auditors and probably external auditors, the first thing they should be doing when they go into a department or look at a project is say, can I see your risk assessment? Well, we know that 95 or 90% of the people will say we don't do any or we haven't done one. This should become a reportable recommendation to management and then be escalated up to the board and the audit committee. So the audit committee should be getting saying, excuse me, Mr. CEO or Miss CEO, we notice that you're not doing risk assessments and therefore you don't have a good system of internal control according to COSO. What are you going to do about it? But there is just such a vast lack of knowledge on behalf of the board, and in this case on the internal auditors, that these things have been missed. But they're there, they're in writing, they should be done. So sorry to preach, but that's where I'm at.
No, but those are great points, John. And this, you have to keep the pressure up to maintain standards, and this interplay between the board and the internal audit is quite important and interesting. But I do like your take here that asking questions is one of the central roles of the board. But their personal preference seems to be to not rock the boat in many cases.
Absolutely.
And
absolutely.
maybe they are even afraid of a powerful CEO, and maybe they don't even view their role in that way. So maybe they think they are there for other reasons, whatever those may be. So I wonder, what are the structural sort of problems here? How can we make boards understand this role and the importance of asking good, tough questions?
Well, I think there are a couple of things. One is they need better training so they understand what they're supposed to do. Secondly, they need a chair who will bring out these issues, either in board meetings or quietly and confidentially, right? So that the CEO doesn't control the board. I mean, we had a CEO that wined and dined the board members, took them up to his cottage in his boat, and they became his best friend. Exactly. So there was a complete conflict of interest, right? They felt they were his good friend, and he had them basically eaten out of his hand. And so they weren't doing their job. So I think it's really up to the chair to make sure that they're doing their questions. Now, what I have found in talking to my colleagues and peers in the US, in the large companies, they often have an ex-US senator or ex-US general on their board. And these people are trained in court martials and in Senate hearings and what I call learning to peel the onion. So somebody gets an explanation and they dig deeper until they hit solid ground. What happens in Canada is, as you pointed out, board members are shy, they're quiet, they don't want to rock the boat. So, but they feel they should ask a question. So they usually ask a question about something they already know the answer to, so they don't appear stupid. And so they ask the question, they get an explanation, which in some cases is not particularly good. And they say, okay, thank you very much. They feel they've done their job. They haven't really pushed. And so I got in trouble once because I was talking to our chair and he asked me for advice on corporate governance because he knew I was a student of corporate governance. And I said, well, excuse me, sir, but your board members aren't pushing management. They aren't asking the tough questions. They aren't peeling the onion and going deeper. And I thought this was a confidential conversation. Unfortunately, he went back at the next board meeting and said, John Fraser says, you're not asking tough questions. And so suddenly I had a couple of board members who were not happy with me. I mean, he had broken my trust, which was not appropriate. But the point is, that is, I think, the answer. The chair has to force people to ask tougher questions.
Yeah, very, very interesting. I couldn't agree more, that to ask the tough questions, that's where the value lies in these boards, that especially.
Yeah, that's what shareholders think they're doing. That's what shareholders think they're doing.
Yeah, I mean, that's the job description. If you look at this from how boards relate to management teams in theory and so forth, but I wonder how many of these boards see it that way. It's like they are more there to give some good advice and glamorized consultants role rather than asking these really tough questions with respect to what kind of risks are we taking? Are they proportionate to are the profits we're generating proportionate to the risks? When times are good, it will seem like everything is just moving along nicely, but the risks are building up, and you need these people who can
absolutely
dig deeper and ask some tough questions. But to end this conversation on a positive note, is it fair to say, John, that boards are becoming more risk aware and that they are moving in the right
they're now aware, they're now starting in, they're now, some of them are asking to see risk profiles, but I don't know that they have deep conversations about them because, as you know, a risk profile is like a company's balance sheet. It's a point in time, and risks are not a point in time thing. Risks are a curve, right, over a period of time. And some people say, well, risk profiles are no good. I don't agree with that. A risk profile is a good basis to start a conversation. So the board should be using that to probe, to ask questions, to get into, okay, well, if you point that this is a high risk now and that you're using a 5-year period, how do you see that over the next year? How do you see it over the next 10 years? But they should be using that as a basis for asking questions around risk.
Exactly. Those coming back to those conversations that are so important in risk management. And all right, John. Finally, here, can you tell us about something, or can you tell us something about your new book on ERM?
I would be pleased to do so. For those that don't know, our first book on enterprise risk management, which is a how-to. So that has in a lot of good chapters on credit risk, market risk workshops, risk profiles, operational risk, sort of the basics. And that book was 28 chapters long. We have basically redone the book. We've kept the good chapters, but we've expanded it, and it now has in 43 chapters. But we've got some incredible authors. We've got professors like Paul Walker from St. John's University, Annette Mikes from University of Oxford, Bruce Branson from North Carolina State University. So we've got both academics and practitioners, and we've added a tremendous amount of exciting new chapters. There's cyber risk, there is outsourcing, there's project risk, there is innovation, there is bias, cybersecurity, your chapter on foreign exchange, scenario planning. I mean, it's quite incredible. Also chapters on the board's role in overseeing risk management, and a chapter on how ERM should be implemented. So, I mean, this book is just going to be absolutely wonderful because a lot of this stuff you can't find anywhere else. I mean, we still can't find how to run good risk workshops anywhere else, even though our book is now 10 years old. So it's a wonderful book. It's going to be out the first week of July. It's now going into, it's in with Wiley now, getting ready for printing. For those who don't know, there's also a sister book that we issued in 2015, which are case studies of companies, how they're actually doing enterprise risk management. So you've got General Motors, you've got TD Bank, you've got Lego, you've got Mars, you've got Zurich Insurance. So major companies. And it's also then, I've included a few mini case studies. So if you're teaching enterprise risk management, these are short, couple of pages long. And what you do is you give your students this case study at the beginning of the class. You ask them to read it, discuss it, and then you take it up. So they're ideal for teaching enterprise risk management. So anyway, we're really looking forward to this, and it's going to be a great book. Thank you.
Yeah, I can attest to that, John. Already the first version of the book was a fantastic resource, all these great chapters, and with the expanded version now, it's I'll be ordering my copy as soon as we hang up today. And
you'll be getting a copy as an author.
Oh yeah, that's very nice. I'm pleased to hear. John, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. It's greatly appreciated. It's been my pleasure talking to you today.
Thank you very much for having me. I enjoyed it. Your good questions.
That's great, John. Always a pleasure. Look forward to talking to you again soon enough. Have a good day.
Thank you.